enabler. Today, we're going to be talking about the new economy, new models for the economy, which was the topic of our latest special feature, which was guest edited by Crystal Simeone and Joe Swinson. And we have a number of the contributors to that feature who Joe and Crystal were able to assemble with us today. They are each going to share a few initial thoughts on the topic. And then we will ask some questions and we will hear from you. You'll see in the Q&A there's an opportunity for you to introduce yourself and also type your questions and comments. So please don't be shy. Tell us where you're coming from, both intellectually, but also where you're coming from geographically as well, given the fact that we hope to have contributions from all around the world of philanthropy. But the topic of the new economy, which is the subject, as I say, of our special feature, our in-depth special feature, is a challenging one for philanthropy, not least because it is itself implicated in the very economic models which enable it to also contribute to the public good. And there are concerns increasingly about ruling and prevailing economic models pursuing endless growth at the expense of the planet and the needs of the many, with certain groups and communities feeling excluded from the fruits of prosperity. But there are calls for community-owned assets, the equitable redistribution of goods, and a new chorus rising for a new economic model, one that prioritises social well-being and environmental health. But against that, with swirling economic storms, inflation, and maybe a new Trump era of trade wars, philanthropy faces big questions. How can we and it effectively navigate these challenges and support new approaches? And that was really the questions dominating our latest special feature, which looked into some of these novel economic ideas. And our panelists today, through their contributions to the special feature and beyond, are really on the cutting edge of looking at how philanthropy is addressing these questions and what it looks like for its beneficiaries. And we asked ultimately, how can philanthropy even become a powerful engine for a more just and sustainable future, while also examining our own role in the economic system? And to discuss those questions, I'm delighted to be joined by the following panelists. Laura Carvalho, who is the Global Director of Economic and Climate Prosperity at the Open Society Foundations, which has a major program of work on this topic. More so, welcome Laura. Also delighted to be joined by Brian Sorensen, who is the Executive Director of the KR Foundation and also a contributor in the latest issue. We also have, in the middle of my screen, perhaps in yours as well, Professor Julia Steinberger, who is a Professor of Ecological Economics and researches and teaches in the areas of ecological economics and industrial ecology. And finally, we have Sarah McKinley. She is a community wealth building consultant who's also worked quite a lot with philanthropy. So delighted to welcome all of you today, and thank you so much for your contributions and for joining us. We'll start, I think, with Laura. Please do introduce a little bit about the work of the Open Society Foundations and how it is navigating this topic. And as you hear Laura speak, feel free to type questions into the Q&A as you go along. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Charles. Good afternoon. Good morning to those who are in the South. So I think we are facing, of course, a very risky time. One element of it is the contest over the successor of the current economic system. And of course, there is a contest. We still don't know what's emerging as the new economic paradigm. The risk is that we end up with a new system. Of course, the current system is not delivering, but the risk is that we end up with a new system that is a neo-nationalist system, authoritarian in its nature, that sees each country on their own. And of course, we all move inwards in ways that don't make the global economy a system that is going beyond the sum of its parts and end up not delivering to the citizens what we want to see, namely lower inequality, good quality jobs, etc. On the other hand, we have a big opportunity, and this is what our program at OSF is trying to look at, which is the climate transition offers a once-in-a-century opportunity for economies to really transform themselves structurally. We will have the transition will change the way economies function. There are losing sectors, there are winning sectors. Each country has different challenges and opportunities to develop and to even be able not only to face the costs that this transition generates with more resources, but also to take opportunities and economic benefits from the climate transition. And this is, I would say, the sort of progressive post-neoliberal model that we are trying to foster through this program, one that really sees the government as central. Market-driven solutions have not been able to deliver on the crisis that we're facing. So how can economic policies be shaped in each country context, which are different? There's no one-size-fits-all solution to deliver on these multiple goals. So climate, economic growth for the countries that are still underdeveloped, jobs, inequality reduction, etc. For that, of course, governments need the resources, they need the capacity, different tools at hand, and I think philanthropy does have a big role in sort of at the same time promoting those that are generating the new ideas in each country and in each context, but also creating the political economy for these policies to be demanded in these contexts. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Laura. Just before we go to Brian, could you say a little bit more about the Open Society Foundation's specific programs of funding work in this area? It might be instructive in illustrating some of what you're saying.
So the Economic and Climate Prosperity Program that I lead is focused on fostering green economic transformation agendas in 6 priority countries, but also some aspects of the work are global. The countries we're prioritizing are Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Africa, and Senegal. This is an initial set. It may evolve over time. And what we're doing there is to really give grants to think tanks, academic centers that are generating ideas for new economic models that do deliver on climate, but also on development and other goals, socio-economic goals. And that see climate and development as complementary, which is something that is hindering the trade-offs between those dimensions, is really hindering climate action in the global south. And we're also giving grants to civil society organizations that act in this space and trying to create a connecting tissue that really both from the economic justice side and the climate justice side look at the question of climate and development and try to put forward these economic policies that are able to deliver on these goals. We also work with governments and policymakers who champion these agendas in these countries. And then globally, of course, there's the enabling condition, the enabling conditions of these country-led models that need to prevail, in particular the financing and the resources that countries need and creating fiscal space for them, but also on trade. The trade system has been questioned and is in crisis. Of course, now the US doesn't care about free trade anymore. Out of a sudden, it even, I mean, I'm not even only talking about Trump, but even before, the WTO has been abandoned as a rules-based system. And so what's the new system? And we would like to see one that is not about double standards, but instead enables developing countries also to move up value chains and have their own industrial policies to develop.
Thank you, Laura. And an important reminder about the importance of a rules-based system for trade and economics, particularly for kind of economic prosperity that we're talking about here. So with that, moving from the Open Society Foundations to the KR Foundation in Denmark, where Brian Sorensen is the executive director, as I mentioned. You're also funding in this space because of your commitments to addressing the climate crisis. So you're working at the intersection of economic models and climate, something that comes out very clearly in your article for the Alliance feature. So perhaps you can just elaborate on that while introducing some of your work.
Thanks. I'll be happy to. And it's great to be here today. And hello, everyone. And this is such an important topic, right? The interplay between philanthropy and the economy. But perhaps firstly, let me just briefly clarify a few things about KR Foundation, because we are a somewhat unusual foundation. It was established here in Denmark, where I'm standing, back in 2015 as a kind of a project foundation with the purpose to address the root causes of climate change. So we're smaller than OSF, approximately 20 million euros annually is our budget, and most of it comes directly from other foundations, and mainly from a large Danish family foundation. So actually each year we apply for funding. So we are in a sense a project ourselves as well, and we're not guaranteed funding, but we do have some financial visibility until 2029. And I think that this setup probably gives us less baggage, if you will, and more flexibility and focus, perhaps, and many other philanthropic entities which have been around for decades. So why do we, as a single issue foundation focused on the climate crisis, also pay attention to the economy? And well, as I try to explain in the article in Alliance, it is because the unfolding climate crises, as we see it these days, as well as the biodiversity crisis, they are symptoms of an underlying ecological overshoot, which in turn is caused by a fundamentally unsustainable economic system. Right? We see emissions that keep rising, so does resource extraction, with global recycling rates being below 10% and actually even falling. So in other words, the economy as a whole is being subsidized by nature on an account that is about to run out. Right? And that's why we in KR Foundation, we work on economic system change. We're trying to bring human economic activity back within the planetary boundaries in a just and safe way. And evidently, that's also the topic of the Alliance magazine, or this edition, right? Parts of philanthropy are holding back that change and being part of the problem. But as I try to argue in the article, I do think that foundations also have the option to be part of the solution. And I think it relates to the role of philanthropy, how it can situate itself outside of the domains of the market and of governments. It has the potential through that position to address some issues that these domains either can't or won't, right? Such as the need for the transformation of our prevailing economic theories and practices. So in my view, philanthropy, when practiced well, can act as society's risk capital, if you will, investing in organizations and practices that can help bring about systems change. And you asked me about the relationship between climate and economic models, Charles, and well, basically, our mainstream economic modeling and thinking is just out of whack. It doesn't reflect the biophysical reality. So that's why, as a climate foundation, it makes a lot of sense to look at the way we perceive of, theorize about, and practice the economy, our economy.
Thank you. That misalignment is something I think Julia Steinberger will come to in a moment. But before she does come, I just want to ask you, you mentioned intriguingly that philanthropy can be part of the solution, and you argued clearly about some of the approaches philanthropy can adopt, but you also acknowledged it can be part of the problem. And just want to briefly ask you where you think philanthropy is part of the problem. Is it its neglect of these issues, or is it the way that it invests its assets, or what are the problematic elements of philanthropy's own involvement in this, and how can it be overcome?
Well, this could be could turn into a long answer, right? I think the duality here is obvious, or the tension. And in India, it was very well explained in the book Winners Take All by Anand Giridharadas from a couple of years ago. I think many viewers to this webinar have read that book, right? So the main argument is that there's a global elite of corporate leaders, philanthropists, wealthy individuals. They often frame themselves as agents of positive change, while they're also perpetuating and benefiting from the very systems that create inequality and injustice. And I think that certainly holds true for some foundations. I mean, none mentioned, none forgotten. because we are part of the current economic system as well. But I do also think that in philanthropy has the possibility to step outside that system and take a look at it, and from that vantage point, try to influence it and change it. I mean, and of course, there's been an extensive literature about some of the conservative foundations in the US providing dark money, capturing politics, etc., right? So for sure, this is a thing.
Thank you. Although in fairness to them, I should argue we should acknowledge that dark money can be an issue on the left as well as the right of the political spectrum, but very much take that point. Let's come to you, Julia Steinberger, Professor of Ecological Economics, as I mentioned. You have a research project on living well within limits and how we can respect planetary boundaries whilst also managing growing population and economic growth. So it'd be great to hear your reflections on your own work and also what you're hearing from Foundation colleagues here today.
Thanks so much, Charles, and thanks to all of the people who have organized this event and are participating. So within my past project, Living Well Within Limits, and now within the REAL project, which is the biggest European project ever funded on, or full stop, ever funded on post-growth economics or degrowth economics. The challenge that we're really trying to do is to rethink what if we were trying to provide conditions of well-being for all people on the planet, then what could we do, what would we do differently, and would that allow us to remain within planetary boundaries, so deal with climate change and biodiversity loss and so on. And the answer is that in theory it's possible, in terms of, it's not, the challenge is less technical in terms of existing technologies or technologies that would allow us to obtain the material and energy services or the nutrition, et cetera, that we need to satisfy human needs and to achieve decent living standards. The problems are very much ones of the economic system in terms of its inequality. So the riches of the ones and the poverty of the others are not disconnected. They're very much connected through the economic system. The reason that people are rich is because others are poor, and that in order to achieve well-being for all within planetary boundaries, we actually need extremely equal economies. And it's okay for everybody to have enough, but it's definitely any kind of surplus based upon that becomes hard to argue. So we have a challenge of equality. And we also have a challenge of power and of what the economy is organized to do. And I think one of the things to understand is that our economy is working very much as it is designed to do in terms of power accumulation, in terms of profit and wealth accumulation. Then the people with the wealth, I guess, get to fund foundations, which is nice for them. But this is just not a sustainable system, and it needs to be challenged full frontally. One of the things we're trying to do within our current project, and that I'm trying to do in general, and to encourage other academics and anybody in this sphere to do as well, is to think about what those power structures look like very specifically, and how they manifest themselves as obstacles to a democratic collective effort of trying to do the best we can within the limited time available. And I think that's one of the, so I think I wrote a blog post on this for Alliance magazine on the Atlas Network and the promotion of neoliberal economics through the Atlas Network and its think tanks. And I think that that's something where we definitely see a role for philanthropy on the side of large industry, on the side of the fossil fuel industry and of large extractive industries, really transforming the world for the worst in terms of inequality and environmental destruction. And I think that the seriousness with which one should take the effort of reversing that trend is not yet anywhere on the horizon. And on that cheerful note, Alison, give you the floor back.
Thank you. In my mind, I'm just wondering, I have a lot to reflect on there for everyone, but that question of how much is enough in terms of prosperity and wealth accumulation, whether that's on an individual or a government level.
Okay, so that's something that I probably should answer a bit more specifically. So basically what we start out with is sort of like a perspective on human needs. We all have needs for, socializing and food and shelter and economic security and whatnot, and education and healthcare and so on. And on that basis, we then sort of scale up to what that looks like on a household level, but also on a social level in terms of infrastructure. And what living well within limits requires is it does require massive investment in public services and efficient infrastructures. So this is definitely not something like that an individual can somehow wake up in the morning and say, hey, I'm going to achieve this. This is something that is a collective effort with public services and public infrastructures being the absolute linchpin. And that means investment in these infrastructures, very much so.
Thank you. No, that's very clear and very interesting. And please, as you're listening to these very powerful contributions, think of your questions you would like to ask our panelists. Feel free to put them in the chat or in the Slido where there's a Q&A, and we'll try and pick them up. But thank you for that perspective, Julia. Now going to turn to Sarah McKinley, a community wealth building consultant and expert, for your perspective, having worked on the ground with groups and organizations and communities trying to build wealth from the bottom up. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Charles, and thank you so much to the whole Alliance team for having me. It's an honor to be part of this discussion and with these great panelists. I have the privilege of being able to work to help support communities that are looking and directly engaging with some of these solutions in place. So to Dr. Steinberger's point, this is not necessarily a technical problem. We have solutions, we have answers, and in communities across the globe, we're actively applying them. As we heard earlier, we need to look towards country-led models, but those country-led models need to be based in community-rooted local models that are working and are being deployed across the globe. And so community wealth building is one of those models. It's a community-rooted economic development model that builds more just, equitable economies based on broadening direct community ownership and control of wealth generating assets in place. So things like land and housing, things like enterprise, things like financial tools and mechanisms and institutions, labor itself as a wealth generating asset. So broadening, creating new forms of broad-based ownership of those things. And the idea is that this is how you can grow some of those community-owned assets that Charles was speaking to. It is prefigurative. It is designing how a different economic arrangement and agreement and social contract can deliver more equitable outcomes for people and for planet. It is also pre-distributive. So instead of being redistributive, instead of relying on the agglomeration and accumulation of wealth that then needs to be distributed through institutional and taxational forms, it actually builds institutions that distribute that wealth, that distribute the benefit of our shared resources in a more equitable way from the get-go. So the community wealth building framework is a way of connecting existing community activity, community-rooted actions such as cooperatives, employee-owned cooperatives, community land trusts, community investment vehicles, things of that nature, connecting them not only to each other, but to the institutions and systems that can help to scale these activities and make them greater than the sum of their parts, so that they're not just fringe projects to address a very specific need, but begin to get to the scale of the social need that we have as a human community. It connects to things like direct procurement flow, redirecting procurement flows and investment flows, shaping policy, the policy environment, supporting capacity building and professionalization. So adding all of those things together in a connected and coherent framework for local economic development. And this requires collaboration and coalition building, involving multiple partners at different levels, from local government to community-based organizations, to enterprise, to community organizers, to local activists. And by its nature, it requires cultural and behavioral change. It requires rebuilding the practice of participation, self-determination, ownership, and ultimately democracy. It's about reinserting our own self-determination, our own agency over our economic conditions and how they benefit ourselves. And it's happening already. It's been happening for generations, but it's becoming a more formal movement and beginning to scale in more intentional ways with local governments, health institutions, other broad-based institutions, taking up this model, thinking about their own performance and business behavior in places in the UK, like Preston in the North Ayrshire in Scotland, in places like Amsterdam, in places like Barcelona, in the United States, in Chicago, in Atlanta, in rural areas, small towns, post-industrial areas, and so forth. And it's looking at how not only do we develop wealth, but how do we use what we already have in more sustaining and sufficient ways. And ultimately, community wealth building as a model that is functioning in a generative and circulatory way should be self-sustaining, using and better directing, better utilizing the assets that we already have, the public services, the public institutions, the investment flows, the money and budget that we already have, in a way that addresses issues upstream rather than dealing with the ill effects and consequences of them, the externalities downstream. So ultimately, that's what it should look like. But at the moment, we're trying to change the system while we live in it, right? We're using the tools that we have in the system that we have, and they're imperfect. And what we lack, and Dr. Steinberger already sort of alluded to this, is the infrastructure, the capacity that connects and sustains this work for the long haul. And this is a role that philanthropy needs to start stepping into. How do we fund, how do we support, how do we resource that infrastructure development for the long term? And that means patient capital, patient investment, not outcomes oriented, not project oriented. It's about relationship building. It's about culture change. It's about creating space and time for organizations, for individuals, for institutions to make these changes so that they're not constantly responding in crisis with limited capacity, limited time, and limited resources. So it's about building that relational and cultural shifting space, which requires an infrastructure, including capital. And that is something that the right has done quite intentionally for the last 50 years, is making that capital available in a patient and open way, and in a way that allows for failure and rebuilding. And so we need to start moving in that direction with philanthropy taking the lead.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that very strong advocacy for community wealth building. And just before we go to some questions that I see are emerging, just want to give the other panelists just an opportunity to respond to that. Do you see a role for philanthropy to step up to fund these models? Will it make the kind of difference that you're suggesting, Sarah, or will it actually just be a marginal impact? Whatever, however well intended. So we'll go first to Laura, and then Julia, and then Brian, and then we'll pick up on some of the questions, starting with Diakumba in a moment. I'll read out her question in a moment, but over to you, Laura.
Thank you. No, I think these are very important initiatives. As we know, the current economic system is not only about a form of government or even an economic theory. It's also about subjective experiences. And so neoliberalism is also about how individuals think of themselves, how incentives are designed, and I think local experiences of community-based economic systems can also be transformative by changing the way individuals perceive themselves as part of an economy, right? And so we change the measurements, we change the way the system is, the way communities engage with that system. I do see these local experiences as also part of a macroeconomy. And so I think the challenge we have is that especially for most of countries in the world that have not achieved yet the level of income and wealth that would be sufficient, according to Professor Julia Steinberger's criteria, right, that she described for what we all need as human beings. Many countries in the world still have a challenge to generate those resources in a sustainable way, in a fiscally sustainable way, in a way that, given the way financialization and the financial system has created cycles and instability and in these countries that have to do with how financial markets and the real economy are integrated. And so the system we live in, as Sarah was describing, I think these creates a lot of challenges for developing countries. And so I think there's a complementary way of addressing the problem, which is about creating sustainable forms of development. And that, I think, needs to happen at the national level. And philanthropies, even though they do play a role in changes the system, I think the role they play should not be one of replacing governments or trying to replace governments, and instead, and I think that's another mistake that I would say philanthropy has done that has perpetuated the problem over time, which is to try to fill the gap as opposed to create and make sure the system creates accountable governments that are able to deliver on that social infrastructure on the one hand, education, health, the public services, and all the other pieces that are needed for these economies to thrive. But on the other side, also have a strategy and a vision of development that is able in the long term to deliver those sufficient levels of wealth and resources for these economies where these communities are embedded in, right? And so here, there's need for national level thinking, there's need for new economic models that is, especially in the times where we live in, with the debt crisis, with the climate crisis, and the multiple layers of crisis, are going to get to these combination of job creation, development, fiscal sustainability, and climate sustainability, inequality reduction that is needed. And so I think these are two sides of one coin, but the post-neoliberal model that we want to see definitely have the new macroeconomy, and at the same time, a very rooted community-based system that is strengthening democracy.
Thank you. And just a brief comment, if you will, from Julia and then Brian.
I think that the question of development orientations that allow these kinds of efforts to arrive, I think that that's a really important direction to go in, and I think that this is something that where philanthropy has a role. So I would support Laura.
Brian?
Yeah, I think I'll keep it brief as well. I think we do need these models. Sometimes I hear from colleagues in philanthropy that we're looking for something that can scale, right? And I think that's often a challenge, because some of this work you do at that level is very situational, right? It's driven by particular individuals, and it's kind of tailored to the specific context of that place. So I subscribe to the word dissemination, right? How can we disseminate this approach? So I'd actually like to throw it back to Sarah in the form of a question, right? How do you deal with that concept of replicability or scalability or dissemination when you work at that level and we face these global challenges?
Go ahead, Sarah.
Actually, I jump right in. It's a huge challenge. I mean, that's the short answer, is it's a huge challenge. And I would say, I think, look for a model that's replicable, and it doesn't really work that way. For it to be truly sustaining and sustainable, it needs to be rooted in the assets of the particular place, right? And it needs to grow from, be directed by, and owned by the people there and the place, right? And so there's no direct replication, and I don't think there should be, but there are lessons that can be learned. There are exchanges, there are ways of utilizing resources. There are things that you can model in specific, right? Institutional forms, for example, things of that nature that you can replicate and adjust to your own locality. But those kinds of learnings, transatlantic, bilateral, multilateral, that's part of the infrastructure that's lacking, right? And so what you're seeing right now is many places are reinventing the wheel. They're starting from, or they're using what they have that they've been doing all along, but they're adding these dimensions, by hook or by crook, without that sort of that learning from afar. And that is a role that I think is super important for philanthropy to help play, is those learnings, those exchanges, that space for iteration and dissemination and modeling. And again, it's not a replicable model, but it's a model that can inspire and create action in your own context as well. And so short answer is it's really difficult. Long answer is it needs resources and can be done.
Well, and a potential role for philanthropy in supporting the new economy infrastructure that you've been describing, and of course, philanthropy funding infrastructure in general across a range of issues is something I know is an ongoing challenge. But we're going to go to some of the questions, starting as I promised with Diakumba Kasama, who is in the Hewlett Foundation over in Silicon Valley, and she asks: is the new economy developed in conversations mainly held in the North with Western experts? Is that really going to be capable of centering decolonized ecological and racial justice? So a challenge to us, and by extension all maybe philanthropic organizations in the global North, about the extent to which there is representation and input from those that are outside of those places. And just one other question to read out, or a couple more before we go back to the panel. Amanda Jordan, she asks, and this really speaks to your comment, Sarah, what does the panel see as the hardest barrier to crack in order to achieve the widespread adoption of a circular economy? And how do we most effectively engage citizens to adopt circular living? So if we agree that this is the right way to live, how do we get more citizens to adopt it? And then I just want to pick up in the chat from Patricia Rosenfield. Welcome, Patricia, from a historian and practitioner at the Rockefeller Archive Center, I believe, who asks, is any of this essentially new? These have been key concerns since the Club of Rome, and decades of foundation efforts to build community and household wealth. For example, the Grameen Bank, who is looking at why these efforts haven't taken hold sufficiently, especially with the threats to the rules-based system today. So could we actually bring in a more historical perspective to actually ensure that the measures that are being proposed are going to have more chances of having the traction they need? So those are three questions, which I invite our panelists to respond to any of them they feel that they want to, and then we'll just go round. But perhaps we'll start this time with you, Brian, if you want to take any of those, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you. I'll be happy to. So perhaps the last one, I can start out with the last one, right? So why haven't we been successful? And this is, I think Julia studied this as well. Well, actually, back at the time, the Club of Rome, there was a lot of attention paid to the Club of Rome and their report, and it did actually make headlines, right? But it coincided with the neoliberal turn, and then it was swept away simply. Right? So we've had the blueprints for a long time, right? And it's pretty disheartening that we're picking it up again, and mainly just continuing that work. But it's been an incredibly strong economic and cultural force, right? The neoliberal turn, and now since 2028, I think we're starting to see the cracks in that paradigm, right? The famous Italian philosopher Anthony Gramsci once said that the old paradigm is dying and new is being born, and now is the time for monsters. And I think we in many ways live in a time of monsters, right? And you can even make that really personal these days. So we just have to realize that that's the situation we find ourselves in. We're in opposition to very, very strong forces here, incredibly powerful vested interests. So it's not a given at all. This will be an ongoing fight and struggle to push for these values.
It's like to respond on that question of learning from historical failures and having a more kind of historically contextual analysis of this question. Go ahead, Laura. I think you're gonna, and then Julia.
Sure. I would also like to speak to the question on sort of developing countries' perspective and northern versus northern solutions. I agree with Brian that we, in terms of the historical approach, that we are in a very specific moment of history and crisis of the current paradigm. Of course, it could go in very different directions. It's a crossroads kind of situation. It could, the system could be replaced by something much worse, even worse than neoliberalism, which is a kind of a version of neo-nationalism that doesn't deliver and increases inequalities between countries. And I think that links to the first question, which is we analyze a lot the inequalities, the kind of self-perpetuating nature of inequalities within countries that the system generates. But of course, there's also the dimension of inequalities between countries. And when we rethink the system with only rich countries in mind and their challenges and their economic systems, and replace that by even well-intentioned progressive economics, let's say Bidenomics or other examples of policies that we're looking at and that do try to combine climate and other socioeconomic dimensions that are relevant, right? But if that's the perspective we take to rethink the current system, unavoidably we'll land in a system that maybe achieves lower inequality within some of the rich nations, but will definitely increase inequalities between countries unless we really intentionally rethink the system globally. We will land in a scenario where some countries then are able to, let's say, bring back some jobs and create some other economic benefits for their citizens, which is very relevant, but the rest of the world is still left behind and is still facing most of the consequences of the multiple layers of crisis that we're living in. And so we need definitely that these post-neoliberal solutions are informed by developing countries' perspectives. That's one piece that has appeared in the Alliance magazine, Eating the Elephant interview that I participated on with Crystal Simeoni and Joe Swinson and Paul. And I think that's one piece. We need models that are informed by these different challenges. And even when we think about circular economy, this may not speak to someone who lives in a developing country and is facing all the consequences of the different layers of macroeconomic crisis, where governments don't have the resources, are deep in a debt crisis and are having to pay more interest under that than they spend in health or education to their citizens, right? So we need to take that into account. And that's why I think that having macroeconomic solutions as part of this is really relevant. Having development visions is really relevant in a new economy. It's not just, let's say, the micro-based or community-based solutions that we need to think of. And these are complementary. And when we challenge neoliberalism, we need both.
Thank you, Julia.
Yeah, so three very challenging questions. I think in terms of the question of the global north, having these conversations is very relevant. And in research we face, so I come from academia, and in research we face really structural barriers, including things like you can't hire people depending on where they come from because they are required to pay higher tuition fees or other things like that. And so certain types of grants, for instance, in the UK where I used to work, you couldn't even hire somebody from overseas because depending on the grant money, they just wouldn't pay for it. So we have structural issues around the kinds of people we can employ. We have structural issues around the kinds of topics we can study. So often within a country or within a region in the global north, we'll be asked to focus on Europe, or we'll be asked to focus on the UK or Switzerland or whatever. And it's rare to get funding where we're really free. And so that's why that was sort of a long preamble to ramp up to saying that I'm really grateful to be working on a European project where we were able to have the freedom to hire who we wanted, which includes a lot of people from the global south, and to study topics of global inequality, unequal exchange, and systemic post-colonial inequalities. And we're doing it. There's a lot of interesting stuff there, but we're just to say that we have to be aware that these challenges really do exist. And a lot of stuff is invisible to us because of what these challenges have been in place. We've just not been able to study this stuff. In terms of the learning from the Club of Rome and history, which also goes to Amanda's question on what are the obstacles, I think the Club of Rome was very interesting sort of as a technocratic argument around population and resource use and where the economy is going, fine. But it was blind in terms of the political economy and power dynamics, and that's an unforgivable sin. And I think that, I guess, the main progress that has happened since then, and the reason why you can't just solve the problems of the world with good advice, is you have to know what you're facing, who you're up against, how they operate, how they're going to take advantage of you, and how they don't care that you have physics on your side, social justice on your side, a stable and prosperous economy on your side. They don't care about any of that. They're just in it for their own interests, using their own methods. And I think that that's the main obstacle. Not just I coming from industrial ecology as a topic, I'm a little bit opposed to this idea of the circular economy as the way forward, because as we know, we can't recycle everything. Like, we can recycle a lot more, but we can't recycle our way out of this. We need to go to a lot smaller economy. We actually need to degrow. I don't think there's any way around that. Physically, we need to degrow a lot. The obstacle to that, again, is not technology, it's not prosperity, it's not all the good things we would want to be able to do, but it is definitely power structures and the people who are profiting from the current system, where they're trying to take us, and the methods that they're using to get there. And we need to study that a lot more.
So the circular economy is necessary but not sufficient. Do you want to respond, Sarah, or comment on any other of the questions raised, or we can go to another round of questions? I can see there's more that have come in.
Yeah, and there's a lot going on in the chat, and so I hate to sort of eat up time, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that community wealth building, it's a current term that has been articulated to sort of capture many things, but the activities within a community wealth building frame grow out of the efforts of communities in the global south. They stem from indigenous communities, colonized communities that are asserting their own self-determination and seeking liberation through these kinds of cooperative, collective, indigenous ways of being. And the idea is to take those learnings, to use those learnings, integrate them into our modern context, but in a way that then creates the space for us to redefine, to relearn, to unlearn, to relearn. And that was my point, sort of about needing to have resource for that culture change. Someone just popped in the chat that the words we use are insufficient. That's entirely true. But we need to create new ways of being with one another. I have the privilege of being in this role where I'm, my goal is to try and help disseminate some of these learnings and ideas and practices with communities, in partnership with communities who are doing the work on the ground and don't have the capacity or the bandwidth or the wherewithal to be doing that dissemination work. And so we all need to find our roles, and we need to have the space to then redefine and reshape and reclaim the terms, the language, and the outcomes for what that looks like. So learning from communities who have been extracted from, intentionally cut out of our current economic system, but have gotten by in really powerful and sustained ways. And so that's what we need to center moving forward. And we need the resource to do that. And I'm advocating for this on behalf of those communities. And then how do we tier it up to the macro level, as we've been talking about here?
Specific industry. This is from Aleda, who highlights that the fashion industry is notorious for overproduction and responsible for a significant amount of global greenhouse gas emissions and violations of workers' rights. And sorry, bear with me, I've lost my place momentarily. And Elena asks, what would be reflection on the importance of including human rights and workers' rights specifically in response to climate and ecological crises, particularly with reference to that industry? And then we'll take a point from Eshban, who notes that various global South communities have been responding to system-wide issues, including climate change and human rights, with little to no funding from the dominant international philanthropy systems, perhaps with organizations like OSF excluded. That's my own interpolation, because I know OSF does a lot on that. But they exist as an alternative system outside the dominant system. To what extent is new economy thinking about existing emergent alternative systems, such as communities doing the long-term work to grow their own resources? And there are others in the chat that you might want to just read and pick up yourselves, but I want to just go back to panelists on those two questions. Is there anyone that would like to take either of them? Just feel free to jump in.
I'm sorry, Charles, I had a very hard time understanding you in the first question. I didn't actually understand which industry we're talking about.
Apologies. The fashion industry, notorious for overproduction and waste. And can a just business model be achieved with if you're not addressing human rights as well?
I'll take something there. We recently, so one of the things we're interested in is this idea of economic democracy, because basically if decision-making is happening in the economy according to the free market, it's basically leaving the most powerful actors to keep running the show. So we need to start taking decisions within our democracies, as various panelists have been talking about in terms of specific initiatives. And as part of doing that, we need to take human rights and workers' rights, as also community rights, if we think about environmental justice and environmental racism, for instance, or colonial dumping. So we definitely need to take human rights and workers' rights into account, because otherwise we're taking the wrong decisions and harming people. I think that the fashion industry has a lot of attention focused on it. Arguably, other industries are also very, very bad. Basically, agriculture and agribusiness, any industry, there's any industry where the sites of extraction are non-unionized and very far away from the value added that their extraction leads to the benefits of, is going to be vulnerable to massive human rights abuses and worker exploitation. And so there are actually reports, international reports from the International Labor Organization, and maybe foundations could be working much more closely with the values and the International Labor Organization to look at this. But there are these reports that basically categorize industries according to worker abuses and worker vulnerability, child labor, and so on. And I think that this is something to take extremely seriously.
Thank you. And I note here just the work of the Loudest Foundation that has been doing work in the fashion industry as an interesting example of philanthropy really pushing the boundaries. Perhaps that's something to look at in a future conversation. I also, just before I come to the other panelists, want to bring in a comment from Jeff that I thought was interesting. How can you build on the $1 trillion informal economic system between remittances and informal savings, based on small groups holding each other accountable and local wisdom fine-tuned over generations? as some of you have been noting, these economic models have existed for a long time. So how can those kinds of models be supported as well? So feel free to respond to that or anything else you'd like to at this point. Should we go to Brian? And then Laura? And then Sarah?
I think that's out of my area of competence and knowledge. I mean, I wouldn't be able to weigh in on that. And there's another question in the chat I would like to answer though, but I'm also cognizant that time is running. So it's up to you, Charles.
Please do respond to the question in the chat that you've seen that you want to respond to. Absolutely.
Oh, there was a question from Stephanie. So she asks, how do you funded partners on the ground in their growth overcome the local national restrictions, i.e. long-standing obligations from the government towards industries, agriculture, for instance, that influence NGOs' agendas so much? And how do you as a funder help to give them more voice? And I think that's an important question, because we see some industries in national settings that are wielding a lot of power and very influential. And what we try to do in a Danish context at least, is to do two things basically. So we would fund capacity. The local NGOs fund their work, especially comms capacity, strat comms capacity, so the ability to do polling, public sentiments, etc. So that's one thing we would do on the funding side, and then we would also offer up a platform for coordination among civil society organizations, because in our experience, sometimes the think tanks are not aligned with the activists. But if you sit with them and hash out a common goal or a desired objective, it's actually possible to put together a pretty hard-hitting strategy. So that would be my answer to that question.
I guess it's for me to jump in, but you're muted, Charles. So I would be very brief and would try to answer to the question of whether we should use or not the word development. And I want to remake the case for using it. And I hate to be the macroeconomist in the room, but there is something that is happening in the global South, which is that climate has been weaponized by authoritarians very easily. And one of the reasons, and we speak a lot of different barriers to climate action. And of course, there's the financial barrier, there are the power barrier that Julia mentioned. But that power barrier, the political barrier, has been very much about framing the climate transition as a big cost and a big economic cost and a big cost to development. And this is really winning completely the debate. If you take the mainstream debate in the South, and if we don't start thinking about the climate transition as an economic opportunity and start reclaiming the word development, even if we think of development in a completely different way, we will just lose that battle. And this is why OSF is really focusing its efforts on what we're calling the Economic and Climate Prosperity Program, in the intersection of economic and climate. We're really trying to think of these models that deliver on several dimensions at once at the national level. And I think that's really important politically if we really want commitment by countries, citizens, and governments to climate action. We all know that the climate problem will not be solved by individuals. It needs to be in governments, economic and other areas of policy in a very big core, as a very core priority. And I think there's no way we're going to win that if we only frame the problem as either circular economy or other pieces of this, and don't look at really the broader economic system and the macroeconomy. Thank you.
Thank you. That's important to acknowledge that. Sarah, final word to you before we wrap up.
Well, I know we're at time, so I won't say much. It's been a great conversation. And just to say, I think, what Laura was just saying, we need to reclaim these terms. We need to be able to speak these terms to the power structures that are dictating the extraction, of our resources and driving our economy. We need to be able to use those terms to then be able to reclaim them, right? So we're doing a 1-2 game, and it's not easy, it's not pretty, it's not pure, but we have to do that in order to make the space for real change. So thank you.
Thank you. And I know that you and all the other panelists will be fighting in your own ways for that change. We are at time. I want to thank all the panelists for their contributions today, and for everyone that's joined for some expert contributions, perspectives in the chat. I have a note saying that they felt that it's a very important and timely conversation. It'd be great to have a panel including counterparts from Mexico, India, Philippines, and South Africa, and elsewhere. And that alliance is something we really do endeavour to try to do by providing more global coverage. So we'll certainly bear that in mind as we take conversations on this and other topics forward. In the chat, you'll see a note to the discount code for those that aren't but would like to now consider subscribing to Alliance. If you want to take up a 20% discount on an Alliance subscription, don't forget to use the link in the chat using the code SDG20. And as a reminder, subscribing to Alliance ensures you always benefit from free access to this and our other events. Our next online event is on the 13th of February, where we'll be looking at the essence of philanthropy in Asia. Whatever that might mean, and what that might hold. Tune in on the 13th of February to find out more. Our next special feature will be looking at migration and refugees and philanthropy's role in relation to that. That will be out in March, so do look out for that. But with that, I'd just like to say thank you to all of you for joining us today, and goodbye, and we'll see you next time.